Welcome to Journalists Roundtable. I'm Phil Beckman. Today we're joined by Carter Walker, a reporter with Votebeat, Jon Delano, money and politics editor at KDKA, CBS 2 in Pittsburgh, and Gillian McGoldrick, Harrisburg reporter for the Philadelphia Inquirer. Now, Pennsylvania's primary election will be held on April 23rd, and we're entering into campaign season. Gillian, do you get a sense that voters are paying attention?
I think that they are just starting to. It seems that the presidential primary seems to be over already, even though at this point only 2 states have voted. But there are a lot of races that will be really important in the primary, particularly the Attorney General's race at the state level, the Attorney General's race, and then a bunch of state House primaries. Half of the state Senate is up for re-election, so it's going to be a busy time.
Jon, what kind of a sense do you have for voter attention right now?
Well, I agree with Gillian that it's just beginning because, after all, candidates are just now filing petitions to run for public office. In Pennsylvania, they have until the day before Valentine's Day to get their nominating petitions filed in both the Republican and Democratic primaries. So it's just beginning to heat up. I went through all the candidates out here in Western Pennsylvania, and in many races, we don't have challengers to incumbent lawmakers. And that was classic 2 years ago. It seems to be classic again this year. So we may find ourselves with a Soviet-style ballot where there's only one candidate, the incumbent, running for each of these different offices. I do think we'll have some exciting races for state attorney general in particular. We may have some primaries, certainly on the Democratic side. We're also electing state auditor general and state treasurer. Democrats lining up to run against the 2 Republican incumbents. The Attorney General seat, I should say, is an open seat. So there's a lot of reason beyond the presidential race to be interested in Pennsylvania politics this year. But I think it's just beginning. It's a little early.
Carter, what kinds of trends are you seeing that you find interesting?
Well, one thing we're paying attention to now is the experience of election directors. We've heard a lot about election directors leaving the post with the stress of running elections nowadays. We've done some research and found that they are, in fact, leaving in pretty high numbers. For this year's election, we're going to be down about somewhere between 15 and 20% years of experience. And that's a problem that we're paying attention to since, as we saw in Luzerne in 2022 and in Northampton and Greene County this past election, having less experienced election directors can lead to more problems. So I think that's something that your average voter is probably not paying attention to, but they will be aware of if it ends up causing problems with ballots having mistakes on them or things not getting done in a timely fashion. So that's something we're paying attention to.
Jon, you wrote about voter registration among 18-year-olds in Pennsylvania. What did you find there?
Fascinating story. When you consider that Donald Trump won Pennsylvania in 2016 by about 42,000 votes, I think it was, and Joe Biden won in 2020 by some 81,000. Well, consider this. This year, 160,000 young people turn 18 and become eligible to vote. So 18-year-olds alone could dictate who wins the state of Pennsylvania. But there's a problem. They don't register. And even if they register, many of them don't vote. So there's a group out of California called the Civic Center that did a study looking at school districts, because if a school district really gets engaged on a nonpartisan way, encouraging their young people to register, you will find more people registered to vote, the young people, 18-year-olds, in those school districts than in others. And so they took a look at school districts in the Philadelphia area and the Pittsburgh area. I, of course, was focused on Pittsburgh. But in none of those districts does the number exceed 47%. And the vast majority, it's about 10 to 20% of 18-year-olds registered to vote. So I thought that was pretty significant. And obviously, both parties need to make a play for younger voters, not only to vote, but to register in the first place.
Now, one of the key races that you mentioned was that for Attorney General at the state level. And Gillian, you've written that the state Republican Party endorsed York County District Attorney Dave Sunday earlier than usual in the process. So why was the Republican Party so eager to endorse somebody?
Yeah, the Republican Party met before the petition period started earlier this week to coalesce around one candidate and actually endorse. In 2022, they chose not to endorse in the governor's race or the U.S. Senate race, and that ended up being pretty disastrous for the party. Once in the general election, in the primary they chose former gubernatorial candidate Senator Doug Mastriano, who lost by 15 percentage points or about 800,000 votes in the general election to Governor Josh Shapiro. And they also in the primary election, celebrity physician Mehmet Oz, he ended up winning the primary by just about 1,000 votes. And so there was a lot of mudslinging in the primaries for both of those races. They want to avoid that this time around, but it looks like they won't actually really avoid it. Although the party did endorse earlier than usual, one of the other candidates withdrew himself from consideration for the endorsement process. Representative Craig Williams, who represents Delaware and Chester counties in the state house, he said that he's just going to run anyway without the endorsement. And so despite the efforts to coalesce around one candidate sooner, doesn't seem like they will just have one candidate on the ballot, and there will still be some mudslinging.
Hey, Phil, can I chime in on the Attorney General's race on the Democratic side?
Sure.
Because I found this to be interesting, and that is that there was no endorsed candidate for Attorney General from the Democrats. Instead, they've got all these candidates on the ballot, or at least trying to get on the ballot. They're circulating petitions now. So we won't know for sure who's running until February 13th. But what I find most interesting is that I'm going to name some counties where these candidates come from. Montgomery County, Bucks County, Philadelphia County, Delaware County, and Allegheny County. So what do you see here? You see a concentration of candidates from Philadelphia and its suburban area, and one candidate from Western Pennsylvania. And that one candidate happens to be the only candidate who's run statewide 4 times. He's won, and he used to live in South Central Pennsylvania in York, Eugene DePasquale, the former state auditor general. He has moved back home to Pittsburgh. So he now will have Allegheny County after his name, while all these other counties will be concentrated in the southeastern part of the state. So just as a political analyst, I would say this gives a little edge to DePasquale as the only candidate from west of Delaware County, I guess, running on the ballot. It'd be interesting for sure.
Carter, this is a big election year. We have presidential candidates on the ticket, as well as the 3 row offices. There have been changes to voter registration rules and how some things are done. Governor Shapiro announced on September 19th that changes to voter registration within the Department of Transportation. How do you think that both the presidential election as well as these changes of voter registration will affect voter participation?
Yeah, I think the presidential election itself is going to obviously have much more of an impact on who's getting registered. You know, if you look at registration data, you always see spikes in the federal years, particularly presidential years, just because there's more organizations trying to get out the vote and register their voters. Automatic voter registration does have an effect. Some academic studies show that it will increase the overall registration, register people who wouldn't have otherwise gone about it through other means. And the Shapiro administration released some data recently. I don't have the exact figures, but showing that it had their change, which was basically from saying, yes, I don't want to go through this process at the point of registration at the DMV, to now you have to opt out of it instead. That has had some effect, but I think it's more likely that the registration bump we'll see is just from people wanting to engage in the election.
Now, Jon, when you mentioned that there are many races where you don't have challengers, And then there are others where, Attorney General that definitely get much more attention. Does this reflect the different sense of the stakes in these elections?
Well, I think to some extent that may be right, Phil, but I also think that the incumbency is so powerful in Pennsylvania that it really reflects more whether you have an incumbent running for re-election, particularly for state house and state senate. These individuals become very ingrained in their communities and are very difficult to defeat. And so that's why you see so few challenges. I was looking at southwestern Pennsylvania. We've got 42 House seats that are generally in the area that I cover. And so far, I think I see 3 or 4 House seats that are open seats. And most of the time, those are House members who want to run for Senate, or they're running for Congress. They're running for some other office, so they're not running again for re-election to their state House seats. So you don't get very many open opportunities to run for office. And when you do, you then attract more candidates. For example, State Senator Jim Brewster is retiring this year, and so we're seeing more candidates line up to run for his seat. But in most cases, people don't take on the incumbents, whether they're Republicans or Democrats, at least not in the General Assembly. Statewide offices, that's a little different because that's a jumping off point for running for other office. But for the General Assembly, I can't speak to Philadelphia. Gillian will know more about that, but I suspect the same is true at that neck of the woods too.
Yeah, I would just add that even though there is very, very strong positives to being an incumbent in Pennsylvania, there's like more than a dozen members who have announced that they won't be seeking re-election this year. One just in Philly yesterday announced that at the start of the petition period. So these are people who are either retiring or they may just be leaving politics. So that opens up a bunch of seats, which is especially important in the Pennsylvania State House, where they have a 1-seat majority right now. For the Democrats, only have a 1-seat majority. So 12 plus people leaving the General Assembly really will potentially change control of who is in charge next year.
Now, another statewide race. Go ahead, John.
I was just going to say, the other race that we're looking at, certainly are the races for Congress. We have 17 congressional seats in Pennsylvania, and some of the competitive ones are back east more so than here. In Western Pennsylvania, we do have one competitive seat in November for sure, the 17th congressional, with Congressman Chris DeLuzio is going to be facing off likely against a Republican state House member, Rob McCurry. But in the spring, we're really looking at the race with Congresswoman Summer Lee. She is the first African-American woman elected to the U.S. House of Representatives from Pennsylvania. She is part of the squad, so she's quite on the progressive left wing of the Democratic Party. And as a consequence, she's attracting a number of opponents, at least a couple so far. And we'll see whether that materializes into a battle. But that's one of those rare times when an incumbent is perceived as having some issues. In her case, it's not just because she's a very strong and vibrant voice for the left-wing, progressive, socialist wing of the Democratic Party, but she's also been portrayed as being anti-Israel. And that has meant there was a big effort to defeat her when she ran the first time. And I think we're going to see more money coming in to that particular race this time. So there are unique situations as you go around the Commonwealth. That's one of them.
Carter, the election management has been a topic that over the past several election cycles, and you talked earlier about the directors at some of the different local areas. But also there's the issue of voter rolls and some of the systems that are used to manage voter rolls. One of those was a new system was recently canceled. Mm-hmm. Can you talk about that and how that might affect this election? Yeah,
that one has some interesting nuance to it because Pennsylvania, since after the 2002 Help America Vote Act, had to implement an electronic voter roll management system. And we did that through a system called the SURE system, Statewide Uniform Registry of Electors. But since it was built in 2002, technology has advanced a lot since then, and the system has just become very buggy, outdated, hard to use. It crashes sometimes. I saw it crash in front of me one time while an election director was using it. So it just really has needed update for a couple of years. And in 2020, the Department of State had signed a contract to do that with a company called B-Pro, later acquired by another company. But the contract just was not moving along. Deadlines weren't being hit. The product that they were creating, that election directors had gotten a test drive on early in 2023, it just was not meeting the needs of the state. Our laws are somewhat complicated and have some antiquated parts to them that make creating an electronic system for them just incredibly difficult. So they decided to cancel that contract and pretty much go back to square one. The nuance about it is it's not likely to have much of an effect on the 2024 election because the Department of State had already decided that they weren't going to meet the rollout timeline to have it in place for this election, so they opted earlier in 2023 to stick with the old system, the legacy SURE system, and maybe roll out the new one in 2025. But now that they've canceled the contract, it's not sure. We're not positive when the new system will be implemented. So we're going to have to stick with this buggy system until that happens through this election. The good news is, though, that they've been upgrading some of the physical infrastructure that counties use to actually connect to the SURE system. It's a system housed with the Department of State, so counties need special computers and dedicated connection lines to connect to it. And the Department of State has been upgrading those for every county, hoping that'll help improve some of the connectivity issues. But it's still likely to be a barrier.
John, one of the outcomes of last year's election was a new Allegheny County executive, Sarah Innamorato, and she recently has been in office for a short while, but she's put out a survey to try to see what people think. What types of things is she looking for?
Well, it's very interesting. Sarah Innamorato, the brand new Allegheny County executive, is both the first woman elected county executive. She is also the youngest county executive at age 37. As she herself points out, she's the first tattooed county executive, as far as anyone can tell. She has a nose ring. I mean, she's really very unique. She also, I might add, is I've known her for a number of years. She's also really a very nice person. When you sit down and talk to her and chat with her, as I did just a week or so ago, she comes in with a very strong progressive agenda. She's part of the progressive wing. She's very close to, for example, Congresswoman Summer Lee and Mayor Ed Gainey in the city of Pittsburgh. She's part of that wing of the Democratic Party. And she comes into office with a lot of proposals, a lot of ideas, and a lot of things that cost money. The question that she hasn't addressed is how she's going to pay for all this. And so that was part of my sit down. I had that first sit down with her 14 days into her term, I guess it was. And I tried to press her on it. But at this stage, it's a little unclear whether we're going to have reassessments in Allegheny County, which would bump up taxes for some people, might reduce for others, and or an increase. We have not had a county property tax in 12 years because the prior county executive refused to raise taxes. So we will see where that all leads. But she's very different from the other county executives. And I think, as I say, has a platform and a program that she wants to implement. It's a little unclear how that's all going to happen. And I've been around the scene for more than a couple decades here, and I'm not quick to judge elected officials on their 14th day in office. I think you got to give them a little bit of time to get their feet wet and to see where things are going. But Sarah Innamorato is someone that I think perhaps similar to Sherelle Parker over in Philadelphia. I mean, we've got brand new people coming into office, and what does it mean? At least in Allegheny County, I'm not sure yet what it's going to mean on a practical level to everyday voters and people.
Well, Gillian, John mentioned Sherelle Parker, mayor of Philadelphia. How is a new mayor creating a different sensibility within the city?
Yeah, she's still getting her feet wet, just like John had said about county executive in Murado. Mayor Parker, she's still setting up her administration. She just handled her first snowstorm, but she is really trying to push this image for the city of one Philly, that she really wants to unite the city, that has been pretty down on its luck over the last few years. The record gun violence, though it has started to decline over the last few years. One of the biggest, poorest cities in the country. So she has a lot of things she needs to tackle very early on here, though. So she's still laying the groundwork. I'm very interested, though, too, in how much she comes up to Harrisburg to advocate for whatever she may need for the city as a former state representative, as well as Mayor Ed Gainey. I always saw him up in the Capitol from when he was in the General Assembly. So I'm very curious about how she will be able to advocate for what the city might need and how she'll work with the delegation in Harrisburg to get whatever the city needs.
Gillian, as part of the finalizing of the budget in December, a bill was passed and signed by Governor Shapiro that would create a special prosecutor for the public transportation sector in Philadelphia. Why was that special prosecutor created?
Yeah, this is a Republican priority here for a while. Republicans in Harrisburg have wanted to ensure that all of the laws are being enforced in Philadelphia, since the city has now twice elected District Attorney Larry Krasner, who's very progressive, and he has approached the job under a criminal justice standpoint. So they have wanted to ensure that all of the laws are being enforced there. And so the special prosecutor would oversee SEPTA, which is the transit in southeastern PA, and any crimes that happen there within 500 feet, I think, of any SEPTA station, which is everywhere around the city and even in the other areas around the city. And this special prosecutor would be appointed by the Attorney General's office. Democrats let it happen. Governor Shapiro signed it. So it's not just a Republican priority. It's something that was a part of the budget deal. And District Attorney Krasner has gone to court. He has sued, saying that this was unconstitutional. And the Attorney General's office so far has failed to appoint that special prosecutor, even though the deadline was January 13th. So we'll see how this goes.
Carter, tell us about VoteBeat, and now that as the election is starting to kick up, how will you and your organization start to cover it?
Yeah, well, we cover election administration and voting issues in Pennsylvania, which, as we know, in 2020, that was a big issue that a lot of people were following how we run and manage our elections. So we're going to be focusing on things like, what's going on with drop boxes, what are the rules around them, what are our county commissioners doing. Some people are concerned, are there county commissioners that won't certify elections? We'll be paying attention to court cases like the NAACP case, which is deciding whether or not mail ballots need to have dates on them to be valid. So we'll be paying attention to all those issues. I'm sure the unknown unknowns that are going to pop up this year as well. We work in partnership with Spotlight PA, which gets our work out to other parts of the state. So a lot that we're going to be paying attention to this year.
Hey, could I jump in and ask Carter about
Sure.
drop boxes and the like? It strikes me, county executive in Murado, for example, is saying we're going to provide more drop boxes. We're going to make it easier for people to cast ballots. But it strikes me that we've got an inconsistency across the Commonwealth, where some counties try to do more to bring in voters, and other counties believe that jeopardizes the security of the ballot. Why can't we have a consistent rule that applies everywhere? To me, it doesn't make a lot of sense if some counties can do one thing and other counties do another. Are there efforts, Carter, to bring some uniformity to this whole system?
Yeah, that's a good question, John. This is something a colleague of mine at Spotlight and I had wrote about last year. The basic answer to your question is that we're a commonwealth. Primary power is vested in the counties to make election decisions. Everybody always wants to look to the Department of State and sue the Department of State for things that happen, but it's really the counties that make decisions, and the Department of State has little authority to dictate policy statewide. So on things like drop boxes, it's up to our county commissioners or executives to decide, if they want to fund that, if they want to place them around the county. And in the story that we had done last year, we pointed out that not just with drop boxes, but with a lot of policies, the access that it creates for voters can really vary from place to place. We had an example from Lancaster County, like if you live in one borders town in Lancaster County versus the bordering town in Chester County, the rules for your drop boxes and what else you can do are wildly different. These people could be your neighbors, so it does kind of create a disparity of access.
Yeah, I think it's a real problem because I think that when it comes to voting, the rules should be the same for everybody across the Commonwealth. And frankly, what you say is entirely correct from what I understand. But the General Assembly could step in and mandate uniformity if they chose to do so. But as we know, with divided government, a Republican Senate, a Democratic House, you're never going to get agreement.
I think it's unlikely as well, too, that we'll get major election legislation this year, given that many of them are running for office and it's a presidential year. They don't want to change the rules too much.
Well, our guest on today's Journalist Roundtable had been Carter Walker, a reporter with VoteBeat, Jon Delano, Money and Politics editor at KDKA in Pittsburgh, and Gillian McGoldrick, Harrisburg reporter for the Philadelphia Inquirer. Thank you all for joining us. And I'm Phil Beckman. Thank you for watching.